"Do you trust me?" the millionaire asked, and the innocent young woman felt her heart race. That wedding night revealed a secret that would change everything between them, something she never imagined she'd discover. Where are you watching this story from? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like, because what happened after that question will surprise you. When Cordelia, at 23, felt the trembling hands of Thaddeus holding hers in that suite of the historic Beacon Hill townhouse overlooking the brick facades of Boston, she perceived something no one else had noticed. This 38-year-old man, powerful, feared by entrepreneurs and admired in business circles, was absolutely terrifying. "Do you trust me?" he murmured. In that question, there was far more than any marriage contract could ever express. His voice carried the weight of 15 more years of experience than she had, of accumulated disillusions, of walls carefully constructed brick by brick around a weary heart. The scent of magnolia drifted through the open window, mingling with the aroma of leather and Kentucky bourbon that enveloped him, creating an atmosphere that suspended time. The golden light from antique brass lamps softly illuminated his face, revealing fine lines around his grey eyes, marks not of age, but of responsibilities carried too soon. Cordelia observed this man who could have been her father, according to the cruel calculations made by matrons during Sunday teas. But in his eyes, she didn't see a man seeking to control a malleable young wife. She saw a prisoner silently asking for a key. "Yes," she answered simply. She didn't know it yet, but that answer would define not only that fragrant June night, but the following 18 months, a journey that would transform two strangers separated by 15 years of experiences and completely different worlds into something they themselves couldn't name. The first 3 months were an uncomfortable dance of elegant formalities and heavy silences. They lived in a 19th-century townhouse in Boston's Back Bay, where American aristocracy preserved traditions like sacred relics kept in velvet cases. Every morning began with breakfast, served in the dining room with carved wainscoting, she on one side of the long mahogany table, he on the other, far enough apart that their gazes only crossed accidentally. The Wedgwood china clinked softly against the cups. The Waterford crystal caught the morning light. Conversations were limited to the strictly necessary: the day's schedule, social obligations, the receptions they had to attend as a united couple before the world. Cordelia possessed 3 characteristics that defined her deeply: an integrity so solid that not even the poverty of working-class neighborhoods in Baltimore had broken during her 23 years of life, an artistic sensitivity that saw beauty even in the crumbling facades of old harbor buildings, and a silent strength inherited from generations of women who had survived difficult times without ever bowing their backs. She had accepted this arranged marriage out of necessity. Her family desperately needed resources for medical treatments that devoured every penny earned at the docks. But there was a heartbreaking conflict in this young woman's heart: how to remain authentic in a world of appearances where every gesture was calculated and every word had an invisible price. Thaddeus, on the other hand, was an enigma wrapped in custom Italian suits and Swiss watches passed down through generations. At 38, heir to a wine empire that spanned centuries since the Gilded Age, he had built walls so high around his heart that he himself could no longer scale them. Family pressure had increased in recent years. At 38, he was perceived as dangerously close to becoming an incorrigible bachelor by the conservative society that scrutinized his every move. Grandparents pressed for an heir to preserve the family name. Associates whispered in plush drawing rooms. Matrons exchanged knowing glances. On Sundays, they strolled through Boston Common, arm in arm for appearances. Their hands touched but didn't really hold. Thaddeus greeted acquaintances with a measured nod, while Cordelia smiled politely, playing the role of the perfect young wife: silent, elegant, decorative. At night, they slept in separate bedrooms, connected by a communicating door that remained closed. Sometimes Cordelia heard him walking on the other side, his steps echoing on the hardwood floors, witnesses to an insomnia he hid the following day behind an impeccable facade. The subtle change occurred on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Cordelia wandered the corridors of the townhouse, searching for something. She didn't know exactly what. Perhaps a breath of spontaneity in this gilded mausoleum, perhaps simply a distraction from the loneliness that weighed on her, despite the constant presence of staff. She discovered a partially open door at the end of a hallway she had never explored. Driven by curiosity, she entered. It was a private library, a hidden sanctuary filled with ancient volumes whose smell of leather and aged paper created a timeless atmosphere. The shelves rose to the cathedral ceiling, accessible via a sliding wooden ladder. Light filtered through heavy burgundy velvet curtains, creating dancing patterns on the Persian rugs. But what captured her attention were the books themselves. Whitman, Dickinson, Frost, the poets who had challenged the conventions of their era. She randomly picked one, Emily Dickinson's collected poems, and opened it delicately. The margins were covered with handwritten annotations. Dates went back over 20 years, revealing an intimate dialogue between reader and poet spanning 2 decades. Passages were underlined. Personal notes revealed deep interpretations, philosophical questions. "These verses have haunted me since adolescence," said a voice behind her. Cordelia startled, nearly dropping the precious volume. Thaddeus stood in the doorway, his tie loosened, his jacket absent, a disheveled version of the impeccable man she knew. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude." "No," he interrupted gently. "This room, no one ever enters. Even the staff has orders not to touch it. But," he hesitated, something flickering in his gaze, "but perhaps it's time." They talked until dawn. Not about usual formalities, not about social obligations, but about metaphors and favorite verses, about how Dickinson captured beauty in melancholy, about Whitman's silent rebellion against suffocating conventions. Thaddeus was surprised by the depth of her interpretations. Her 23 years of youth didn't mean superficiality. She saw layers in the poems that he himself had missed despite years of reading, and she was surprised to discover that his experience hadn't made him cynical, only cautious like a wounded animal that has learned not to approach fire again. When dawn tinted the sky above Beacon Hill in shades of pink and gold, and the aroma of coffee and fresh croissants rose from the kitchen, something imperceptible had changed between them. The communicating door between their bedrooms remained closed that night still, but now they both knew it could open. The first real obstacle emerged with the force of a winter storm. Thaddeus's family, the Wainwrights, whose name was spoken with reverence in European wine circles, demanded a Sunday dinner at the family estate in Napa Valley. It wasn't an invitation, but a summons. They arrived on a Saturday afternoon under a leaden sky. The estate, built during the late 1800s, stood amid rolling vineyards that extended to the horizon. Generations of Wainwrights had walked these paths, pressed these grapes, preserved these traditions with almost religious devotion. Mrs. Adelaide, the 70-year-old matriarch, awaited them in the blue parlor. Her silver hair was pulled into an impeccable chignon. Her family jewels glittered discreetly, and her sharp gaze assessed Cordelia like an expert evaluating a work of art of dubious provenance. "Dear child," she began, the term child pronounced with enough emphasis to remind everyone of Cordelia's 23 years. "Thaddeus has told us so little about your Baltimore family." The dinner was a 3-hour ordeal. Each dish, served on the century-old china, was accompanied by insidious questions wrapped in glacial courtesy. "You understand, of course, that the Wainwright name carries certain responsibilities, Mrs." Adelaide continued between bites of roasted duck with truffle sauce. "Generations have preserved our reputation. A young woman of your age might find this intimidating." Cordelia felt the family's gazes weighing on her. Uncle Mortimer, Cousin Beauregard, Aunt Eugenia, all scrutinizing, evaluating, probably finding this intruder from working-class neighborhoods insufficient. This girl who didn't even have old money in her family tree. "Wine traditions require deep knowledge," added Uncle Mortimer, swirling his glass of Cabernet. "Harvesting, grafting, blending, it's an art that's passed down. You can't learn it from books." Thaddeus remained silent during most of the meal, jaw clenched, hands gripping the carved armrests of his chair. Cordelia realized with a pang in her heart that he wouldn't defend her, not out of cowardice, but because that's how these circles worked. Battles were conducted in silence, affronts forgiven with time, and young wives had to prove their worth through actions, not through their husbands' defenses. On the drive back to Boston, as the Tesla devoured the miles in heavy silence, Cordelia stared at the vineyards scrolling past in the fading light. "They're right," she finally said, her voice barely audible. "I don't know anything about your world." "Our world," he corrected gently, without looking at her. "And they're wrong. Knowledge can be acquired. What you have, authenticity, integrity, that can't be learned." It was the first time he'd spoken to her so intimately outside the nocturnal library. The most painful truths often reveal themselves in the moments we least expect them. The 5th month brought a revelation that shook the fragile foundations they were patiently building, stone by stone. It was a Friday evening. Thaddeus had been locked in his study for hours, legal documents spread before him, his tense silhouette visible through the glass doors. Cordelia observed him from the threshold of the adjacent parlor, hesitant to interrupt. Finally, she knocked gently. "Come in," he said without lifting his eyes from the papers. She advanced into the room saturated with cigar smoke and old leather. On the desk, she glimpsed notary letterheads, official seals, clauses underlined in red. "What is this?" she asked. He finally looked up. In his gaze, she saw something she had never seen before. Pure, raw guilt. "My grandfather's will," he answered after a long silence. "Drafted 15 years ago, registered with the attorney in Napa." "And?" He stood, walked to the window overlooking the family vineyards that could be glimpsed in the distance, even from Boston. His voice, when he spoke, was that of a man confessing. "There's a clause. For me to retain total control of the wine estates, I must be married and maintain the marriage for at least 2 years before my 40th birthday. The silence that followed was deafening. Cordelia felt the floor crumble beneath her feet. You were 38 when we got married." "Yes." "So you had—" The words choked in her throat. "You had until your 40th birthday to find a wife. Anyone." "It's not." He turned abruptly. "Yes. At first, that's what it was. A pragmatic necessity. A young woman who would accept the terms, who wouldn't question, who would be grateful for the money," she completed bitterly. "A Baltimore girl of 23, young enough to be malleable, desperate enough to accept." "Cordelia, don't lie." Her voice rose for the first time since their marriage. "Not now. Not after those nights in the library. Not after making me believe that—" She stopped, refusing to cry in front of him. Thaddeus crossed the room in 2 strides and fell to his knees before her. A gesture so unexpected, so contrary to all his aristocratic dignity, that Cordelia was paralyzed. "Yes," he said, his voice broken, his New England accent becoming more marked under emotion. "Yes, that's what it was at first, an arrangement, a contract. But God, Cordelia, I didn't think that. I didn't know you'd be—" "What?" she murmured. "Human?" "Real," he answered, finally looking at her. "Everything in my life has been calculated, arranged, staged since I was born. And then you arrived with your 23 years, and your way of looking at poems as if they could still save the world. And I—" He sat on the hardwood floor, tie loosened, undone. "I found myself prisoner of my own lies. Worse still, I realized the cruelty of involving a young woman your age in my complications. You should be free to discover life, not imprisoned in century-old alliances with a man who doesn't even know how to be authentic." Cordelia looked at him. This 38-year-old man who controlled millions, who negotiated with international magnates, who was feared and respected, reduced to this raw vulnerability on his study floor. And something in her broke, not in the negative sense, but like a dam finally releasing retained waters. She sat beside him, their shoulders touching, without saying a word for long minutes. "I'm afraid," she finally admitted. "I'm afraid of losing myself in this gilded world, of becoming simply a polished version of myself before even discovering who I really am, a pale copy of the matrons who judge in parlors. And I'm afraid," he echoed, "that it's too late for me, that I've spent too many years building walls, that I was taught too well at prep school that emotions are weaknesses unworthy of a Wainwright." They remained like that until night fell completely over Boston, sitting side by side on the cold hardwood, 2 strangers separated by 15 years discovering they shared the same loneliness. Cordelia's decision to resume painting wasn't a whim of a young wife seeking distraction. It was an act of survival. She had spent 6 months learning codes of conduct. When to wear gloves, how to serve oysters without offending traditions, the invisible hierarchy that governed every gesture during family receptions. Each small victory, mastering conversations about harvests and grafting, memorizing genealogies dating back to the Mayflower, cost pieces of her youthful spontaneity. One morning she announced during breakfast, "I want to transform the old ballroom into a studio." Thaddeus nearly spit out his coffee. "A studio? To paint? That's what I did before. Before all this." She made a vague gesture encompassing the townhouse, their arranged life, the conventions that gently suffocated them. "Cordelia." He set down his cup carefully. "You understand what that would mean. An artist wife of an entrepreneur would be seen as eccentric, unsuited to the Wainwright name. So what?" Her eyes blazed with a fire he hadn't seen in months. "Must I be a perfect decoration forever? A porcelain doll that smiles and stays silent? That's not what I—" He stopped, aware of falling into the same patterns as his family. "They'll judge you cruelly. Let them judge." Her voice didn't tremble. "I prefer their judgments to my own disappearance." It was Winifred, the 45-year-old estate's administrative director who had worked with Thaddeus for over a decade, who became Cordelia's unexpected ally. Daughter of a former estate manager who had known the Wainwrights since childhood, she had watched Thaddeus build his walls year after year. "Let her paint," she said one day to Thaddeus as they examined production reports in his office. "You know what happens to living beings when they're suffocated. They die, or worse, they survive as shadows. The family will survive a little art," Winifred cut in. "They won't survive a broken young woman who becomes bitter. Neither will you." The old ballroom, which had hosted waltzes during the Gilded Age, was transformed. Cordelia worked with feverish energy, discovering bricked-up windows that she had reopened, letting in perfect northern light for painting. The smell of linseed oil and pigments replaced that of beeswax and aged wood. Thaddeus sometimes watched her from the doorway, fascinated by this transformation. She wore old paint-stained shirts, her hair pulled into a careless bun, totally absorbed in her canvases. She was more beautiful like this without the veneer of society receptions than in all the evening gowns she'd worn. One evening, he entered the studio. She was working on a canvas depicting the Napa vineyards, but with a perspective he'd never seen, as if the viewer were lying among the vine rows, looking at the sky through the leaves. He searched for words. "It's like seeing for the first time something I've looked at my whole life." She turned to him, a trace of ochre paint on her cheek. "That's how I see your world, from inside out." "Our world," he corrected gently. That night, for the first time, the communicating door between their bedrooms remained ajar. The 9th month brought them to the Spalito Festival in Charleston, where Thaddeus had business meetings and where the family maintained a traditional antebellum mansion. Cordelia had never attended the festival. The evening of their arrival, while Thaddeus was detained at a professional dinner she had politely declined, she went out alone into the illuminated streets. Historic Charleston stood like an architectural jewel in the summer night, its cobblestone streets lit by gas lamps, creating dramatic shadows. But what captivated Cordelia were the spectators, thousands of people of all ages, laughing, debating, living with an intensity she hadn't seen in months in polished Boston parlors. She followed a crowd toward a performance in the historic district. The opera was overwhelmingly powerful, and she let herself be carried away by the force of the music, the passion of the singers, the total absence of that aristocratic composure that characterized her daily life. When she emerged, cheeks flushed, eyes bright, Thaddeus was waiting for her at the waterfront park. "You found me," she said, surprised. "Winifred called, worried you'd gone out alone." He paused. "But I'm glad she did." They walked together through the streets illuminated by festival lanterns, a tradition of the event. The aroma of magnolia and jasmine floated in the warm air, mingling with music notes escaping from courtyard gardens where groups played until dawn. "I'd forgotten," he said suddenly. "What?" "This." He gestured, encompassing the scene around them, the laughter, the music, the pure spontaneity. "I think I'd forgotten what it meant to simply live." Cordelia looked at him really for the first time in weeks. In the golden light of the lanterns he seemed different, younger somehow, as if the 15 years separating them had momentarily dissolved in Charleston's magic. "Thaddeus," she said gently, "when were you last happy? Truly happy, without calculating, without performing?" He reflected for a long time. too long. I don't remember, he finally admitted. Without thinking, Cordelia took his hand. Not for appearances, not because conventions dictated it, but simply because she wanted to. The contact sent waves of warmth that contrasted with the cool breeze blowing from the harbor. They found a bench near the battery, from where they could see the city lights extending like terrestrial stars. And there, surrounded by the enchanting atmosphere of performances and the intoxicating scent of the South, they had their first truly intimate conversation. Thaddeus spoke of his youth, how at 16 he wanted to become an architect, design buildings that defied gravity, create beauty, but his father had died suddenly of a heart attack, and overnight he'd had to assume responsibilities of a family empire. At 18 he was negotiating with 60-year-old men. At 22 he was managing millions. He'd never had time to discover who he was outside the Wainwright name. "I'm 38, he murmured, "and I feel like I've lived without really living." Cordelia shared her fears that at 24, she'd had her birthday the previous month, she was aging prematurely in this world of appearances, that her youth was slipping away in silent lunches and calculated smiles, that she was afraid of waking up one day at 40 and realizing she'd spent the best years of her life playing a role. "Maybe," Thaddeus said, gently squeezing her hand, "we could try something radical." "What?" "Be ourselves. Simply that. See what happens." In the distance, church bells chimed midnight. Around them, the festival continued its celebration of life, of art, of everything that makes existence bearable. And for the first time since their marriage, Thaddeus kissed Cordelia, not in the forced intimacy of a wedding night, but under the southern stars, because not doing so would have been impossible. The return to Boston was accompanied by a certain new lightness, but also by a heightened awareness of the obstacles that remained. Winifred observed the subtle changes between them with a mixture of hope and concern. She had seen too many false starts in Thaddeus's life to rejoice prematurely. One afternoon, while Thaddeus was traveling to Germany to negotiate with importers, Winifred invited Cordelia to lunch at a small bistro in the North End, far from the prying eyes of their social circle. "There are things you should know," Winifred began after ordering, "about Thaddeus, about why he is, how he is." Cordelia set down her fork, all her attention focused on this woman who seemed to carry the weight of secrets too heavy. "When he was 26, Winifred continued, there was a marriage engagement. Millicent Ashford, daughter of an old money Newport family. Beautiful, intelligent, perfect on paper. What happened? She betrayed him publicly during a regatta in Newport." Winifred's face hardened at the memory. In front of all the assembled high society, she announced she couldn't marry a man so boring and emotionally closed. She humiliated him intentionally, then left with a European count that same evening. Cordelia felt her heart tighten. "Thaddeus didn't publicly show his pain, of course," Winifred continued. "Wainwrights don't show their wounds. But I was there. I watched him close up, day after day, month after month, year after year. Every wall he built over 12 years was a brick of protection against new humiliation." "Why are you telling me this?" Winifred looked at her intensely. "Because I see him opening up again with you, and because I'm afraid. Those walls protect him, but they also suffocate him. If he dismantles them and you—" She stopped. "And I hurt him like she did," Cordelia completed. "He wouldn't recover a second time." Winifred drank a sip of wine. "I'm not telling you this to frighten you, but so you understand. What you're living isn't simple. He's 15 years older than you, 15 years of accumulated scars." "I know." Cordelia played with her glass. "But Winifred, I can't live pretending. I can't spend my life walking on eggshells for fear of breaking something. I'm not asking you to." Winifred smiled sadly. "I'm just asking you to be aware. Invisible wounds are the deepest." That conversation haunted Cordelia in the following days. She began to see Thaddeus differently, not as a man distant by choice, but as a survivor carrying invisible scars. Every time he hesitated before taking her hand, every time he withdrew emotionally, she now saw the shadow of Millicent Ashford. But she also saw something else, the extraordinary courage it took him to try again. The 12th month brought the crisis that threatened everything. German and British investors presented an offer: massive expansion into Asian markets, potentially exponential profits, but at the cost of modifying century-old production methods. Modernize, industrialize, increase volumes. For a family like the Wainwrights, it was heresy. But finances were tight. The economic crisis had affected even the most prestigious estates. The money Cordelia sent to her family in Baltimore came from reserves that were thinning. The pressure was immense. Thaddeus spent weeks locked in endless meetings on Fifth Avenue, emotionally distancing himself. He was regressing toward the isolation patterns he'd cultivated for years before her. Meals became silent again. The door between their rooms closed again. Cordelia felt the weight of insignificance press on her like a lead cloak. After all, important decisions were made in boardrooms where women only entered to serve coffee, and her 24 years of youth made her even more invisible in this world of experienced men. She tried to approach him several times, but he gently pushed her away with excuses about work, responsibilities, the weight of decisions that would affect hundreds of jobs. Frustration grew in her like a rising tide. She had agreed to enter his world, learn his codes, play by his rules. But when would she become more than an elegant accessory? The break came one stormy night, as rain beat violently against the townhouse windows and wind made the old beams groan. Cordelia found him in his study, surrounded by documents, a half-empty glass of bourbon in hand. "If this marriage is just a performance," she said from the threshold, her voice calm but charged with raw emotion, "I deserve to know." He looked up, surprised to find her there. "Cordelia, this isn't the time. It'll never be the time." Her voice rose. "You're returning to your old patterns. You're closing up. You're pushing me away as if these last months never existed, as if Charleston never happened. It's complicated. Everything's complicated with you." She entered the room. "But I thought we'd decided to be honest, to show our true faces, even when it's difficult. I'm protecting—" "Stop," her voice broke. "Stop saying you're protecting me. I didn't sacrifice my 24 years to be a doll in a gilded display case. If you don't want me in your life anymore, say it. If you regret marrying me, say it. But for God's sake, Thaddeus, don't treat me like I'm invisible." The silence that followed was heartbreaking. Thaddeus slowly set down his glass, stood and approached her. For the first time she saw tears in his eyes. "I don't know how," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "How to let you in completely. I spent 12 years building these defenses after Millicent, and every time I start lowering them with you, I'm afraid, terrified. Because if I truly let you in and you leave—" "I'm not Millicent," Cordelia said firmly. "And you need to decide now if you want to live the rest of your life in fear or if you want to try something different." The storm raged outside. Inside, in that study saturated with unspoken tensions, two people stood face to face, separated by 15 years of experiences, but bound by something stronger than age or conventions. "I choose you," Thaddeus murmured. "I'm afraid, but I choose you anyway." The weeks following that confrontation were transformative. Thaddeus began, slowly but deliberately, to include Cordelia in professional discussions. At first it was uncomfortable. The men in boardrooms didn't hide their surprise at seeing a 24-year-old woman seated at the table. Some exchanged knowing glances, others smiled condescendingly. But Cordelia had something they didn't, a fresh perspective. During a particularly tense meeting with British investors, as the conversation circled for hours on production methods, she intervened. "What if," she said calmly, silencing the room, "the solution wasn't to choose between tradition and modernity, but to make tradition itself the selling point?" The men looked at her confused. "Emerging Asian markets value authenticity," she continued. "Century-old methods, family stories, craftsmanship. What you see as an obstacle, the slowness, the small volumes, they would see as luxury." One of the investors leaned forward, interested. Cordelia pulled out sketches she'd prepared, designs for labels combining Wainwright heritage with contemporary aesthetics, concepts for immersive estate tours, collaborations with artists to create limited series. "You're not selling wine," she said. "You're selling an experience, a story, a piece of American soul." The silence that followed was different. It was no longer disdain, but consideration. Thaddeus looked at her with a mixture of pride and admiration. This young woman he'd married to satisfy a testamentary clause was saving the family legacy with creativity that none of his decades of experience could have generated. The transformation wasn't just professional. At home, The walls continued to fall. Thaddeus discovered Cordelia's old sketchbooks, drawings of Baltimore, her neighbors, everyday scenes captured with a tenderness that squeezed his heart. He realized she'd sacrificed much more than her independence for this marriage. She'd left an entire world, authentic human connections, to enter his world of gilded falsity. "Why did you accept?" he asked one evening, leafing through the notebooks. "Really? Why?" Cordelia looked at him from her easel. "At first, for my family. They needed money for my father's medical treatments. And now?" She set down her brush. "Now? I don't know. Maybe because I see something in you that you don't see in yourself. Something worth discovering." That night they talked until dawn, not about business or obligations, but about dreams. He spoke of his old desire for architecture, she of her dream to exhibit in real galleries, not simply as the wife of. They spoke of travels they'd never taken, books they wanted to write, parallel lives they could have lived. "If we could start over," Thaddeus said at one point, "knowing what we know now, would you still marry me?" Cordelia reflected honestly. "I don't know. But I know I'm glad to be here now with this version of you, the real one. Even with my 38 years of baggage? Especially with them," she smiled. "They make you interesting." Cordelia's transformation from decorative wife to creative force attracted attention beyond wine circles. A New York foundation supporting children's hospitals approached her with a proposal: organize a charity exhibition where contemporary artists would create works inspired by American masters, Hopper, O'Keeffe, Pollock, to raise funds. It was exactly the type of project that merged her passions for art and social aid, but it was also terrifying. Organizing an event of this magnitude meant exposing herself to the judgments of high society, who probably expected her to fail to confirm their prejudices about this unsuitable young Baltimore woman. "Do it," Thaddeus said when she expressed her doubts, "and I'll help you." It was new territory for both of them. Thaddeus used his connections to secure prestigious spaces, while Cordelia contacted emerging artists whose work she admired. They worked side by side for months, discovering an unexpected synchronicity. Winifred also got involved, managing logistical aspects with her usual efficiency. She watched Thaddeus and Cordelia work together and saw something she'd never seen before. He laughed. Really laughed, not the polite laughter of society receptions, but an authentic laugh that rejuvenated his face by 15 years. "You're good for each other," she said one day to Cordelia, as they coordinated invitations. "He needed someone who wouldn't treat him like a monument." "He treats himself like a monument," Cordelia replied. "That's the problem." "Not anymore. You've done something no one else succeeded in. You reminded him he's human." The charity exhibition was a resounding success. The Museum of Modern Art was filled with collectors, philanthropists, and art critics. The works were magnificent, modern reinterpretations of American masters, with portions of sales going directly to children's hospitals. But what really marked the evening was Cordelia's speech. Dressed in a simple but elegant gown, her hair up, revealing the graceful line of her neck, she mounted the improvised stage with a confidence that surprised even Thaddeus. "Art," she began, her clear voice carrying through the silent gallery, "reminds us that beauty exists even in pain. That hope isn't naive, that every brushstroke on a canvas is an act of faith in a better future." She spoke of the children in hospitals who would benefit from the funds raised, the importance of preserving humanity in an increasingly transactional world, and at one point her gaze found Thaddeus's in the crowd. "I learned recently," she said, "that showing vulnerability isn't weakness. It's courage. And that's what we ask of these artists, to show their vulnerability through their works, so that others can find strength and hope." The applause was sincere, but more important to Cordelia was the look of pure pride on Thaddeus's face, a look that said, "You are exactly where you should be." The 15th month brought a discovery that changed everything. Cordelia was looking for a book in Thaddeus's study when she noticed a drawer that seemed stuck in the 18th century cabinet. By forcing it slightly, she discovered a secret compartment. Inside, journals, dozens of leather-bound notebooks filled with tight handwriting in blue ink. The dates went back over 20 years. She hesitated. It was a flagrant invasion of his privacy. But curiosity prevailed. She opened the oldest one. March 14, 2003. I'm 22 and I feel like an imposter. Everyone looks at me as the future of the Wainwrights, but I don't know who Thaddeus is outside this name. Does he even exist? Page after page, year after year, she discovered a man she'd never truly known. Not the confident entrepreneur, but someone deeply lost, desperately seeking authenticity under layers of expectations. There were references to Millicent, to the betrayal that had broken him at 26. But what surprised Cordelia was realizing that even before Millicent he was struggling. The betrayal hadn't created his walls. It had simply reinforced them. September 2nd, 2019. Today the grandparents mentioned marriage again. I know what they want. An alliance, an heir, preservation of the name. But how do you marry someone when you don't even know who you are? How do you be honest in a relationship when you've spent your whole life wearing masks? Cordelia closed the journal, hands trembling. This was written only 2 years before their arranged marriage. When Thaddeus returned that evening, he found her sitting in his study, the journals spread before her. His face turned pale. You read them? Yes. She didn't apologize. And now I understand. Understand what? Why you were so afraid. Why every step toward me was like walking on broken glass. She stood, approached him. Thaddeus, even before our marriage, you were searching for something real. For years. He looked away. Those journals were the only places I could be honest. I know. She took his hands. And that's why I don't apologize for reading them. Because for 15 months I've tried to truly know you, and you only showed me what you thought I wanted to see. But there, she indicated the notebooks. There I saw the real Thaddeus. And you're not running away, he laughed bitterly, even knowing how pathetic I am. You're not pathetic. You're human. She forced him to look at her. You're someone who was forced to grow up too fast, to carry responsibilities too heavy, to sacrifice your identity for a family name. And you survived. That's anything but pathetic. That night they talked like never before. Thaddeus shared memories he'd confided to no one. The day he cried before his dying father and was told Wainwrights don't cry. The nights he woke panicking without knowing why. The crushing loneliness of being constantly surrounded by people but never truly seen. And Cordelia shared her secrets, how she too felt like an imposter, how at 24 she feared never finding her true voice in this world of older men and rigid conventions. You know what's ironic? Thaddeus said at dawn. I married someone 15 years younger thinking it would be easier, that a young woman would be less complicated, less emotionally demanding. And, he smiled, and you turned out to be the most emotionally demanding person I've ever met. You refuse my walls. You insist on seeing the real me. Sorry, she said, without really meaning it. Don't be. He kissed her gently. It's exactly what I needed. The 18th month culminated in the event that sealed their transformation, Cordelia's solo exhibition at the prestigious Whitney Museum in New York. The invitation itself had been a shock. The museum, known for exhibiting established artists, didn't usually accept beginners. But her work on the charity project had attracted the director's attention. The weeks before the opening were intense. Cordelia worked 18 hours a day in her studio, perfecting every canvas. The works explored a central theme, identity behind social masks, portraits where faces merged into architectures, urban landscapes where buildings resembled gilded cages. That's me, Thaddeus said one day, observing a canvas depicting a man in a suit, his face replaced by a window through which a stormy sky could be seen. It's all of us, Cordelia replied. You, me, everyone playing roles. The evening of the opening, the museum was packed. Art critics, collectors, New York's cultural elite, all present to judge the work of this 24-year-old woman who had dared to claim she had something to say. Cordelia was terrified, but Thaddeus remained by her side, his presence a silent anchor. What followed was unthinkable. Thaddeus asked to say a few words. The room fell silent, surprised. Thaddeus Wainwright, known for his reluctance to speak publicly about non-commercial topics, mounting the stage, he began with a slightly trembling voice that gradually strengthened. I'm not an art critic, he said. I'm a wine entrepreneur. For 38 years I lived in a world of numbers, contracts, century-old traditions. I thought that was all I was, a guardian of the Wainwright legacy. He paused, his gaze finding Cordelia in the crowd. And then I met Cordelia. She was 23, 15 years younger than me, and I thought, he laughed softly, I thought I would teach her to navigate my world, that my experience would guide her youth. The room hung on his words. But she taught me. She taught me that experience without vulnerability is just an accumulation of empty years. She taught me that youth without the freedom to be authentic is a prison. She taught me... His voice broke slightly. She taught me that showing vulnerability isn't weakness but courage. He indicated the canvases around him. These works you see, they speak of the masks we all wear. And believe me, no one wears a mask as thick as mine. But Cordelia, with her persistence, her patience, her refusal to accept less than truth, she showed me what it really means to live. The emotion in his voice, breaking decades of aristocratic composure, moved people in the crowd to tears, not just because of the words, but because of what they represented. A man publicly demolishing walls he'd spent a lifetime building. So when you look at these canvases, Thaddeus concluded, don't see them simply as art. See them as a challenge. A challenge to ask ourselves, who are we really behind our roles, our titles, our accumulated years? And do we have the courage to find out? The applause was thunderous. Later, as the evening continued and collectors made offers on her works, Cordelia found Thaddeus on the museum terrace looking at New York spreading out under the starry night. Thank you, she said simply. For what? For seeing me. For letting yourself be seen. She took his hand. For having the courage to be real, even when it was terrifying. I'm still terrified, he admitted, but now at least I'm not alone in my fear. They stood like that, hand in hand, looking at the city that had witnessed their transformation, from two strangers bound by a contract to two souls discovering they had perhaps never truly been strangers. True endings are actually beginnings in disguise. The 18th month concluded not with a grand declaration, but with a silent decision that changed everything. Thaddeus, now weeks from his 40th birthday, had officially satisfied the requirements of his grandfather's testamentary clause. The wine estates were secure. Legally, their marriage had fulfilled its purpose. But one evening, after a quiet dinner in their townhouse, Thaddeus placed an envelope before Cordelia. What is this? She asked, confused. A divorce contract prepared by my attorney. His face was neutral, impossible to read. Cordelia's heart skipped a beat. What? Read it, he said gently. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope. It was indeed a divorce contract, prepared, ready to be signed. She looked up at him, confused and hurt. Why? Because, Thaddeus said, kneeling before her, as he had that night in Boston 18 months before. I want you to have a choice. Our marriage began as an arrangement. You were 23 and needed money for your family. I was 38 and needed a wife to satisfy a testamentary clause. Thaddeus. No, let me finish. He took her hands. You kept your part of the contract. Your family received the help they needed. I secured the inheritance. You're free now. Free to leave, to restart your life without the weight of the Wainwright name, without being tied to a man 15 years older with all his baggage. Tears now flowed down Cordelia's cheeks. And if I don't want to leave? He pulled another envelope from his pocket. Then I'd like to propose this. She opened it. It was an invitation, simple, elegant, handwritten. Cordelia Mercer and Thaddeus Wainwright invite you to celebrate the renewal of their vows. No notarized contracts this time, Thaddeus said, his voice charged with emotion. No testamentary clauses, no legal protections drafted by attorneys, just the simple promise to continue discovering who we are together. Are you serious? More serious than I've ever been in my entire life. He gently wiped her tears. I don't want you to stay because you have to. I want you to stay because you choose to. Every day, as I choose you. The ceremony took place a month later, in the garden of the Napa estate, where they had truly discovered each other during that Charleston festival that seemed to belong to another life. It was autumn now. The vines had been harvested, their leaves taking on shades of red and gold in the fading light. The weather had turned cool but not cold, perfect for an outdoor ceremony. Only close witnesses were present: Winifred, some intimate friends, Cordelia's family from Baltimore, and even Mrs. Adelaide, who, to everyone's surprise, had asked to come. I was wrong, she had said to Cordelia the evening before. I judged you by your age and origins, but you've done for my grandson what no one else could. You reminded him he's human. The ceremony was simple but deeply moving. No priest this time, just a civil officiant who invited them to share their own vows. Thaddeus spoke first, his voice strong despite visible emotion. "Cordelia, 18 months ago I married you for the wrong reasons. I had 38 years of cynicism and thought marriage was a transaction, like everything else in my life. But you refused to be a transaction. You insisted on being real even when it was uncomfortable. You demolished my walls, not with force, but with patience. You showed me that 15 years of difference means nothing when two people decide to be brave together." He took a deep breath. "Today, I marry you for the right reasons. Because you truly see me. Because you challenge me. Because you refuse to let me hide. Because with you I'm more than the Wainwright name, and I'm simply Thaddeus. And that's enough." Cordelia had to wait a moment before she could speak through her tears. "Thaddeus, when I married you, I was 23 and terrified. Terrified you were just a mask. Terrified of losing myself in your world. Terrified that the age difference meant we could never truly understand each other." She smiled through her tears. "But you showed me that experience and youth aren't opposites. They're complementary. Your wisdom guided me, my spontaneity reminded you how to breathe. And together we created something that didn't exist before. Not your world, not mine, but ours. Today I marry you not because I need your protection or your name, but because I choose you. The man behind the walls. The man who trembles when vulnerable but is anyway. The man who, at nearly 40, found the courage to begin again. Floating lanterns were released into the twilight sky, as in Charleston, but this time they carried a different meaning. No longer simply a cultural tradition, but a personal symbol of their journey from appearances to truth. Winifred watched the scene with tears of joy. She had seen Thaddeus grow up, close off, suffer, and now she finally saw him live. Mrs. Adelaide approached Cordelia at one point during the reception. "Take care of him," the old woman said. "He seems strong, but he's fragile in a way few understand." "I know," Cordelia replied, "but he also takes care of me. That's how it works." The celebration continued late into the night. At one point, Thaddeus and Cordelia found themselves alone near the vineyards, watching the stars glittering above Napa Valley. "Do you remember the question I asked you in Boston?" Thaddeus asked. "Do you trust me?" Cordelia quoted. "Yes." "And you said yes." He held her close. "I thought you were naive, a 23-year-old woman who didn't understand what she was getting into. And now I realize you weren't naive. You were wise beyond your years." He kissed her gently. "You trusted not the man I was pretending to be, but the man I could become. And you were right." "We were both right," Cordelia corrected. "You also saw something in me I didn't see yet. A potential I was afraid to explore." They remained like that, embraced under the California stars, two people who had started as strangers bound by a contract and had become something much deeper, two souls who had chosen each other not by obligation, but by free and courageous choice. The following month saw other transformations. The Wainwright Company adopted Cordelia's creative strategies, experiencing renewed success in international markets. Her exhibitions attracted increasing attention, not as the wife of, but as an artist in her own right. But more importantly, they continued to discover who they were, together and separately. Thaddeus learned to lower his defenses, to be vulnerable, to ask for help. Cordelia learned that strength doesn't always mean being independent, that leaning on someone isn't weakness. 1 year after renewing their vows for Thaddeus's 40th birthday, Cordelia gave him a special gift, a portrait she had painted of him. But it wasn't a portrait of Thaddeus Wainwright, the entrepreneur. It was a portrait of Thaddeus, the man, sitting in his library surrounded by his beloved poets, his face bearing not a mask of control, but an expression of authentic peace. "This is how I see you," she said when he unveiled the canvas. "Not the mask, the real man." He remained silent for a long time, simply looking at the portrait. Then, without a word, he hung it in his office, not hidden in the private library, but prominently displayed, where all his associates and visitors could see it. It was an act of silent defiance against the conventions that had suffocated him for 40 years, a reminder that behind every social mask there is a real person, imperfect, simply seeking to be seen. An epilogue. 3 years after their first marriage, Thaddeus and Cordelia walked through the vineyards at sunrise. It had become their ritual, these silent walks where they didn't need to talk, simply to be together. Cordelia was now 26. Thaddeus was 41. The age difference that had seemed so insurmountable at first had become insignificant compared to what they had built together. "What are you thinking?" Thaddeus asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "I'm remembering that night in Boston," Cordelia replied. "When you asked if I trusted you, I was terrified. And if you could go back, knowing everything you know now, what would you tell that 23-year-old woman?" Cordelia reflected. "I'd tell her that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing love despite the fear. I'd tell her that the highest walls are built around the tenderest hearts. And I'd tell her," she smiled, "I'd tell her to trust her instinct." Because she was right. Thaddeus stopped, pulling her gently toward him. "And if I could speak to that 38-year-old man, cynical and closed, I'd tell him that 15 years of difference means nothing when you find someone who sees your soul. I'd tell him that vulnerability is the most courageous form of love. And I'd tell him not to be afraid, because what awaits him on the other side of fear is more beautiful than anything he ever imagined." The sun was rising fully now, bathing the vineyards in golden light. In the distance, the family estate could be seen, witness to generations of Wainwrights who had lived by conventions, traditions, expectations. But Thaddeus and Cordelia had chosen a different path. Not easier, but truer. A path where age was just a number, where conventions could be questioned, and where two people could create their own definition of what it really means to be together. "You know what I realize," Cordelia said. "What?" "That we never really finish discovering each other. Every day I see something new in you." "And you in me," Thaddeus replied. "That's true marriage, I think. Not a static state, but a continuous journey." They resumed their walk hand in hand, two people who had transformed a pragmatic arrangement into something profoundly authentic, who had proven that true love has no age, that transformation is always possible, and that sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with the most imperfect reasons. Behind them, the estate stood, symbol of centuries of tradition. Before them stretched a future they would write together, free from the constraints of the past, guided only by their mutual choice to be true, vulnerable, and totally, courageously alive.